Okay, so I'm Rachel Andrew. That's some places you can find me. I also give a link to these slides and things at the end, which has got a bunch of resources, because I'm going to go fairly quickly through some bits and pieces. What I'm not, standing in front of the Web Performance Group, I'm not a performance expert. Really what I have here is a bunch of stuff about new layout that what I would like are people who are interested in performance to kind of know about and to start thinking about, because we've really got a big kind of shake-up happening with how we do layout on the web. So it has to be said, if you've been doing layout for a while, if you've been doing CSS Layout, you'll realise that CSS Layout essentially got stuck somewhere around 2005. Everything else moved on. We got animations and we got all sorts of visual stuff that we could do without having to cut up images and use Flash or whatever. But layout kind of got itself stuck, and we're left with techniques, things like floats, that were never ever designed for complex web layout. They weren't really designed to lay out things at all. They're designed for putting an image up in the corner of some text. And that makes layout really difficult. But things are changing, and we've got these new methods. We've got Flexbox, which I'm sure a lot of people are already using. We've got CSS Grid Layout, and we've got a module called the Box Alignment Module Level 3. And these really come together to make a new system for layout on the web. Now I'm going to talk a lot about grid layout today, so here's the bad news. Grid is a spec in development. If you have used Flexbox recently, or in the last few years, you're probably aware that the Flexbox spec kind of emerged in this really painful manner. We ended up with really 3 different versions of that specification implemented in browsers. And that made Flexbox rather difficult to use, to know, which sort of version of Flexbox you should be using. And I think it's left a lot of people feeling quite nervous about even using it at all. Grid is different. We've got implementations of CSS Grid Layout in all of our browsers, but it's hidden behind a flag. So all the stuff I'm going to be showing you about Grid, you need to enable experimental flags in browsers or use nightly builds of browsers to play with. All the Flexbox stuff is pretty much stuff you can be using right now. So with the bad news out of the way, I'm going to talk for a little while about the characteristics of these new layout methods. Because if we're going to think about how they perform, we need to know how they behave, because they behave very differently to the things that have come before. And they do this because they have a kind of bunch of characteristics. And the first is that they properly separate the document source order from the way it's displayed. And they give us proper alignment control, giving us the ability to center things both horizontally and vertically. And they're responsive by default. And I think we're going to be seeing less and less of people using media queries to do responsive design and actually falling back on just the way these layout methods behave. And most importantly, they give elements in our layout relationship to each other. And that isn't the case with any of the block layouts, things like float and positioning, because there each item is kind of positioned on its own. It doesn't know that it relates to other things in the layout. And that's where a lot of the problems that we've got in layout really stem from, this lack of relationship. So if we use floats, if we float a block left and we float a block right, the left-hand block doesn't know that the right-hand block is taller. So we can't have the background on the left-hand one as tall as the right one. There's no way of doing that. And we've been trying to do this sort of thing for years. This is the faux columns technique. Some of this stuff, if you're really old like me, you'll have used before. This is faux columns. So here we're using a vertically tiled background image to create the illusion of full height columns. And the reason people jumped on techniques like display table turns your CSS layout into a kind of fake table, a CSS table. And that gives the items relationship, because items in a table have relationship. And so that was why that kind of worked, and worked well to do these sort of full height columns. So things like Flexbox and Grid take that idea and they really run with it. So full height columns, that's pretty much the basic behavior of Flexbox and Grid. So this is a simple Flexbox example. We're taking advantage of the default values of the Flex properties. So we've got a sidebar and content inside a Flex container with a class of wrapper. And the sidebar there is running to the height of the content area because it knows that it's in the same row. It's in the same row as the other item, and so it can be that height. And Grid works in exactly the same way. So this is a CSS Grid Layout example. I've got a grid on the wrapper element, I've positioned the sidebar using line-based positioning, starting at column line 1, and the content starts at column line 2. So in all of these examples I'm showing you, this idea of things knowing their place in layout is really important. I've been developing websites for a very long time, and I was doing CSS Layout back in the days of Netscape 4. Anybody else? Netscape 4? Oh, few. It's getting fewer and fewer every time I ask this question, until I'm kind of like the only holdout who remembers what that browser was like. But back then, we were talking about this separation of content and display, and it was kind of the sort of rallying cry of that CSS layout movement. We were trying to persuade people not to use tables anymore, and we're saying, but we can separate our source and our presentation. And it was a bit of a failed promise, and especially once responsive came along, because we are kind of having to mess around with the source in order to get the different layouts that we want most of the time, because of the way things like float works. But if we take a look at Flexbox, so I've got a navigation here which is laid out with Flexbox, and I'm using space between, so Flexbox is assigning the space left over after displaying the items. Flex direction here is set to row, and that's the initial behaviour of Flexbox, and you can also use column to display the items in a column. And we can switch the order of flex items just by setting the flex direction property to row reverse or column reverse. And you can set the order. So I've got a bunch of flex items here, and they're displaying in source order in the flex container, and I've given them each a number so you can see the sort of natural order. And we can start changing their order. So the source order number 1 is now 3 visually. And CSS Grid gives us the ability to change things not in just the one dimension, but in both. So if I set my parent to display grid and create some columns, I can then position these items. Again, I'm using CSS Grid Layout, Grid Column and Grid Row properties. If you've not seen this before, the value before the / there is the line the content starts on, and the second one is where it ends. And that lets us do things like this. We can position things around the grid. It doesn't really matter what order they are there in the source. We can just sort of put them where we like. The constraint for both flex and grid items, they need to be a direct child of the parent container. So that's quite neat, but there's more we can do with grid. So as well as placing items on a grid that we've defined, grid contains these auto placement rules. So we can take a chunk of content, we can hand it to a grid, and it will display it for us. So that's where things get really interesting. So if I remove all the positioning from the grid we used previously, and we just throw that content at the grid, Grid will just start laying the items out, keeping them in DOM order. It'll just pop one item into each cell of the grid. If I add some more images to that gallery, some of them are landscape. So if I add a class to the LI elements that contain a landscape image, and then I set those to span 2 tracks of the grid. So then when Grid starts to lay this out, it lays it out and it finds an image it wants to span over 2 tracks, and so it does that, and then it leaves a gap because that next image is too wide to fit into that single cell, so it drops down to the next line and so on. And Grid will just lay those items out for us. By default, it's progressing forward, it's keeping the items in DOM order. Unless I add this property of Grid Auto Flow with a value of dense. And once we do that, Grid will start to backfill the gaps. So it moves through the content, it finds that space there, it moves on to item 3, then item 4, it's like, oh, that'll fit in that space, it'll take it and it'll put it up there. So this is quite magical and allows for all sorts of interesting layout options. Now you're the sort of crowd who'd be interested in how this works in browsers. That's where you find out how this works in browsers. There's a whole set of rules that I will not read to you, which are how the browser works out how to position items. Because on a single grid, you could have items that you've explicitly positioned, you've given column and row positioning. You could have items that have got rules like our landscape images, which can span 2 tracks. And you've got items which have got no rules at all, and Grid should just put into holes on the grid. And there's a whole set of rules about how that is worked out. There's something else which I'm not going to dwell on too much today, but I think matters. There are obviously really scary accessibility implications with being able to take a collection of stuff and throw it at a grid and jumble it all up. it's worth saying that both with Flexbox and Grid, this reordering doesn't do anything to the logical order. So the logical order of the document is always going to be how it is in the source. So if you're reordering things visually, you're going to have to take real care that people can still, for instance, tab around the document without crazy things happening. I think there's all sorts of discussions to be had on that point. It's worth noting as well, and if you go and look at this code later, we didn't specify rows at all in that last example. So Grid will create row tracks as we just put content in. There's this idea of there being the explicit grid, that's the grid that you've defined when you've created rows and columns. And then if you put something outside of that grid, Grid will just create implicit tracks. So you can put something, you know, 4 rows down or whatever, and it will just create another track for it. So we're creating here the explicit grid. I've got grid template columns and grid template rows. But then if I put that item at grid row 4, that doesn't exist. Grid will just create row lines for that. And you can also auto size those lines, or you can specify how big you want them to be and things like that. So I think one of the hardest challenges, it has seemed, in web design has been vertical alignment. I mean, for how long have we just tried to align things properly in the middle of our screens? And these new layout methods deal very well with alignment. And to look at that, we've got this new module, and that's the CSS Box Alignment module level 3. And essentially, this module takes the features that relate to alignment from Flexbox and it ports them over to other things. At the moment, Grid, but in the future, that could be everything. So essentially, this is the vertical centering module, although it deals with other things like space distribution and things as well. So we're seeing a lot of this in Flexbox, and it's where the specs really come from, is the stuff that was done for Flexbox. But we're going to see this also in Grid. So we've seen how some of this stuff works already. We've got distributed alignment. And in Flexbox, we use justify content and align content to align our items against one of 2 axes. I've got navigation in a row, justify content with a keyword value space between. That lines up my first and last items flush with left and right and distributes the rest of the space equally. If you change the value to space around, you get an equal amount of space all the way around the item, so you get a half size space left and right at the end. If we set align or justify items in the Flex container, what we're doing is changing the align self and justify self properties on everything inside. So as we've already seen, these items in your Flex container there, they've got relationship. So by default, the value of align items is stretch. And this means that all of the items stretch on the cross axis and they're the same height, despite not containing content of the same height. So this first navigation point has got a bit of extra text in. The other items all know they need to be as tall as that, because essentially the Flex container is as tall as the first item, so the others just stretch down to it. And we can also do this vertical centering. We can center them against the taller one. And if you switch Flex direction to column, then align item center will center the items horizontally. And then we can use justify self and align self on individual Flex items to change their alignment properties. So here I've made the third item stretch rather than center. So that's how this works in Flexbox, and it's now been brought into the grid layout spec. So we see this in CSS Grid Layout, but of course then we're working in 2 dimensions rather than 1. So I've got a grid here and I'm setting align items to center, so that will affect all of the grid items. So each of the sort of items here is actually covering 4 squares, but because they're center, they're being centered in the middle of that area. And there's a link there, you can see some of this. Actually, look at the code. And we're justifying the items, so we've got the same grid, same placement, but justifying the items, we'll center them this way. And we can target individual items as well with align self and justify self. So here we've got box A is covering the 4 squares because that is doing stretch, and we've got align self end, start and center. So being able to do this, being able to align individual items and groups of items is really important, and it's very important for responsive design, where we don't know what size the viewport is, but we know that we want things to behave in a certain way according to other things that are in the layout. And that's really the thing about these methods, is they've been designed in a world where we have responsive design, and so they're responsive by default. As I'm sure most of you are working with, perhaps you're writing your own CSS sort of grid frameworks, or you're using grid frameworks, and what we're all doing, either we're doing it by hand or using a framework to do this sort of thing in the CSS, adding these unlikely looking percentages to create columns and so on, and work out the percentages that things need to be in relation to each other. So our new layout methods kind of get us away from doing this a lot of the time. They just sort of do it. They understand proportions. So we've already seen that, say, working in Flexbox, saying justify content space between. That value, if you make your screen smaller, there's going to be less space to share out. If you make it bigger, there's more space to share out. That just works. But we can also target proportions, because responsive design really is about proportions. You want things to stay, in scale with each other, rather than have one thing that's fixed and everything else move around it. So the flex property in Flexbox is a shorthand for 3 properties. We've got flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And we tend to be asked to use, the spec says use the shorthands. The spec tends to encourage us to use shorthands because it resets properties to things if we haven't set them. So here I'm setting flex grow and flex shrink to 1. And what this means is that every box can grow and shrink to fit in the space, but the sort of ideal box width where we start from is 200 pixels. And what that will give me is 3 boxes of equal width. And we've got some nice balloons, local balloons. If I allow the items to wrap, so we use FlexFlow row wrap, and so we can drag the window smaller and see what happens. And as the boxes get smaller than that 200 pixels, the final box drops below, and it sort of spreads out and takes up all the space, because alignment with Flexbox is worked out on a row by row basis. So each row essentially becomes a flex container, and all the alignment happens in that row. It's got no relationship to the stuff above it. If you don't want the boxes to grow at all, you can set flex grow to 0. And they'll just stay at the size, they'll stay at 200 pixels as you get the window wider. And you can target individual items. So I've added rules for box 3. So all boxes can grow and shrink from 200 pixels. Box 3 isn't allowed to grow. And so this will happen. So the amount of space that box 3 needs, the 200 pixels, is taken away. The rest of the space is split between our other 2 boxes that are allowed to grow, and they'll just get bigger and bigger, taking up that space. And so in order that we can maintain proportions as the elements flex, we can assign different values to flex grow and shrink. So here I'm setting box 3 to flex grow 2, and the other 2 boxes remain at 1. And what isn't happening here is that box 3 is becoming twice the size of the other boxes. What happens is after we've taken 200 pixels away for each box, the remaining space is going to be split into 4, and 2 parts given to the final box and 1 part each given to the other 2. And if that sounds like a lot to work out, it is. There's a tester there. You can put in some values and figure out what you'll actually get out of it. Understanding how flex grow works, I think, is probably key to understanding Flexbox once you've figured that out. And once you've figured out how to do it in Flexbox, you'll find our new unit that we have in Grid Layout really easy to understand, because it essentially works in the same way. We have this FR unit in CSS Grid Layout. It's a fraction unit. So it allows you to assign a fraction of the available space. So our simple grid here, 3 columns, all with 1 FR as the width. So we get 3 equal width columns. If we change this definition and we start with 1 600 pixel width column, and then we have these 2 1 fraction unit columns, Grid assigns that first one as 600 pixels, and that's taken away from the available space. And then we have these 2 columns which get the rest of the space split between them. And if we change the last one there to 3 fraction units, the available space divided into 4. The first column gets 1 part, the other one gets 3. So this, just like with Flexbox, means we can create fully flexible layouts that have some fixed width element in them. And this is just like the Holy Grail layout that we used to want to build. And that's very easy. And if you've not seen this syntax before, I've not shown this yet, this is the CSS Grid Layout ASCII art syntax, or grid template areas, where essentially we're describing our layout in the value of the grid template areas property, which is pretty cool. But anyway, it's not really like the Holy Grail layout is what we're all aiming to build these days, but being old, I'm quite glad that we can finally do it, even if, you know, it's not that useful anymore. So that was a real quick fly through some of the interesting new stuff that is coming. And what does this mean in terms of performance? Now, it has to be said, it is very, very unfair on browser implementers to be making any sort of assumptions about how Grid is going to perform once it's out from behind flags and it's all finished. Some of the stuff I'm talking about has really only very recently gone into browsers at all. So it's a bit early to make huge assumptions about how Grid will ultimately be. Some of you might remember there was a lot of discussion about how slow Flexbox was for layout. But in the sort of progression from old Flexbox and those early specs and the new stuff, a lot has changed. And Flexbox performs pretty well these days. That's on the Google developer site, some information about some testing and the fact that old Flexbox was massively slower than what we currently now have in browsers. But one thing is certain, we're getting to a point where we're actually going to be able to make choices about the layout we use and about the layout methods that we use. I think up to this point, it's been a case of, does it work? Because, you know, we get a design, we're trying to build a design, and it really is a case of which of these methods is going to be least awful. And that's kind of the choice. You know, which can I get out the door in time, you know, to be able to build this stuff? That's been pretty much where we've been for a long time. Things are changing. Once we've got this stuff in browsers, I think we're actually going to be able to say which is the best way of using these tools in order to get the best performance, and, you know, depending on what we're doing. And people are asking me quite a lot, you know, what's the difference between Grid and Flexbox? A lot of those examples that I've shown, well, you could build in either. The difference really is that Flexbox is optimized for and built for one-dimensional layout. Grid has been built for two-dimensional layout. So if you want to lay something out in a column or in a row, and you don't care about the other dimension, then you want Flexbox. If you need to control both, then that's where you need Grid. So really simple example. I've got a set of items using Flexbox. Flex space is 200 pixels. The items can grow and shrink. I've got 5 items. And so if they wrap, because that's the amount of space I've got, what happens here is that first row is a flex container. We go to the second row, also a flex container. There's no way of making those two bottom things line up under the top ones, because they're just going to spread out and take up all the space. So each row here is almost treated uniquely. Although they can wrap, you can really only control one dimension. So if we're using grid layout, what we can do here is we can actually set up a grid which we can then sit items on, and we can control both the rows and the columns. This little repeat statement here is very interesting. Basically what we're saying here is autofill column tracks to the size of the container. And that min-max statement says, I'd like them to be a minimum size of 200 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction unit. So what we get is Grid creating column tracks are around 200 pixels, as many as it can get into the viewport or the container for the page, which gives you that Flexbox-like behavior, but you're controlling, once you've created that grid, the items will just sit in the grid. So you can get this kind of layout. And this is the sort of thing that people try and do with Flexbox and find it doesn't really work because it's not been designed to do a grid like this. That autofill behavior has literally just shown up in the implementations. It kind of works in Firefox nightlies. Yesterday I wrote a post about it, sort of creating this kind of thing. There are some examples which work. If you very carefully pick your examples, you can get it to work anyway. But that is going to be a very useful way of creating these flexible grids that are flexible not only in terms of the columns themselves being flexible, but the actual numbers of columns you've got in a container being flexible. So we're going to have to make choices about which bits of these specs to use, not only whether we use Grid or Flexbox, but whether we use which parts of the Grid spec, for instance, we use, because you've got an awful lot of options. In practical terms, doing some sort of basic testing of this stuff, most layout methods, in terms of just a standard web page layout, you want to lay out, sort of your average site, they're performing pretty comparably. I sort of did some tests and thought, there's not a lot of difference here. I found some other people, there's a bunch of tests here that this chap did, I think, for a talk that he did for Smashing Conf. In practice, these things work pretty much the same. But once you start to do things more complex, if you're starting to want to load in loads of items, once you're starting to use JavaScript and you're going to cause things to reflow, then there's quite a lot of choices you could be making just in terms of using Grid to actually tweak that. For instance, do we use Grid or Flexbox to lay things out? Do we want tracks to flex? Are we going to have tracks that are a fixed size? Could the tracks be a proportion of the container? Are they going to be auto-sized? Auto is interesting because it looks at the size of the content inside the Grid item or Flex item. Are we going to use auto placement, or are we going to be explicitly placing things around our grid? Which of those is going to be faster? Do we define an explicit grid, or do we allow Grid to create tracks as it needs them? Do we use this dense packing, which performs surprisingly well? I'd sort of assumed when I first saw this idea of backfilling holes that would be horrendous, but actually it seems to work pretty well in practice. Then there's all this alignment stuff. Do we align everything? It turns out the default alignment method of stretch is actually one of the slower things to do, because you've got to sort of work out the height of everything. This is from a post by one of the guys who is implementing Grid Layout for a company called Igalia. The Grid Layout implementation has been done in Blink by an open source consultancy and paid for by Bloomberg, which is very nice of them. But he wrote a post which is very, very detailed about the actual implementation of Grid in browsers and how the sort of optimizations they're doing to make it work. So it's really not going to be a case of just, should I use Grid or Flexbox or Float? It's going to be, how should I use these methods? And I think that is where there's just a huge amount of work to be done and conversations to be had. And it's really what I sort of wanted to talk about today, is say, look at this stuff. And look at it now, because it's not going to be a case of which method we use. It's going to be how we use it. It's going to be how we advise our teams to use this stuff, how we build frameworks that work with it. And if you're looking at it now, particularly with Grid, Grid isn't finished. The spec's not complete. It's not fully implemented yet in browsers. There's still time to kind of stick your hand up and say, there's a problem with this. I can see a problem with this. And actually get it addressed in the implementations and in the spec before it's sort of out there and we're all living with it. So if any of this has interested you, I'm very happy to talk about it. I've also got a whole bunch of examples that you can play with. There's information on there about what to enable in browsers and what works in which browser at the moment as well. But do have a play with it. I'd love to know any thoughts, particularly around performance and the accessibility of this stuff and the kind of issues that we're going to have to start talking about as this is getting out there into kind of everyone's hands. So thank you very much for listening, and you will find a bunch of stuff there. Thank you.